Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the fanfic reread project. In this episode, we will be continuing our reread of The Dark Knight Rises with a Bruce chapter. Let's jump right in. He still wasn't sure whether he wanted to be there or not. Or rather, he wasn't sure whether showing Miranda the reactor was still a good idea. He was eager to when Fox had come to him on Saturday to tell him that John Daggett was about to get his hands on his company, but over the last few days he'd become wary. So, just a note, I kind of went out of my way to make sure that the timing in this story was very, very accurate, just to make sure that certain things happened when they were supposed to. So, if you'll remember, the story starts sometime before Halloween. And I went out of my way to make sure that the important Bane related things that happen a little bit later happen on Halloween. However, I don't think the story actually does a good job of saying that, because the thing is, the fact that this stuff happens on Halloween is actually, it's not symbolic, but it is very important, because as the story said earlier on, Harvey Dent died on Halloween, meaning that the Joker, his big plan popped off on Halloween. Kind of important. So you would think that this story would actually help you keep track of all the days and be more forward about what the date is, but it isn't. Like, the Halloween mention was the first concrete time that we ever actually got a sense of, oh, okay, so it's October. And then everything else is really vague, like, oh, fall barely touched this place, or fall had only come about a month ago, leaving you hopefully hoping that you're from North America to wonder what exact, I guess it's October. Like, how do you I don't know. It just seems like I did all that work and then didn't show it at all. It's weird. He had to show her. Bane was working for Daggett, and if he got his hands on the reactor, Bane would have it too. But something inside him didn't want to. Then again, maybe he was just being too paranoid. Not that he didn't have reason to be, but he had trouble trusting anyone with anything like this, outside of maybe his closest friends. So does Tony know about this? Or not? Like, if you're that scared, okay, number one, I feel like, and maybe this is like a backwards thing because I don't know anything about business, but it does seem like strange that at no point it's never mentioned, like maybe Tony has like small shares in Bruce's thing and Bruce has small shares in that seems like a fallback plan that the two of them would have if one of them like died in a freak accident or something, especially considering one of them's fucking Batman. Like But I feel like there should be a contingency plan that does not rely on having to show this woman that Bruce doesn't seem to know or like be acquainted with super well this weapon instead of, his best fucking friend. Failing him, what about Peter? What about Mary Jane? Where's Steve Rogers during all of this? He's like Tony's goddad. I feel like he should have some, like, there are multiple other people that I feel like he could have fell back on in this story, and the story just kind of doesn't. To be fair, I will say that no, I do think Steve, because for people who haven't read The Fall, Steve in Earth 1 was Tony's goddad, but this story was written before Earth 1 even existed. So it could be that Steve wasn't Tony's goddad, but even outside of him, Tony himself, as well as Bruce's other two best friends, you would think that there might be some contingency plan that they all have to make sure that all of their stuff goes to the right people when if one of them dies, especially considering that Peter has a chronic illness, and if something happens to him, I mean, yeah, he has a wife at least, but like, what if something happens to one of their friends? Then what? Like, this just seems very strange that this all depends on this one random lady, or else this weird random white guy comes in and takes everything instead of like, oh, looks like Bruce Wayne's dead. I guess everything gets split up between Alfred and Tony and Mary Jane and Peter. Like, that's literally, like, you would think that's how that would happen, But apparently not. Anyway. He straightened himself as he heard the elevator start. They had built it into a trailer in one of their recycling plants on the outskirts of the Hurricane District. It was his idea to build a bunker under the water, but the disguise was Fox's. He could just hear the voices echoing as the elevator moved down. Again, unnecessary those. "This is it, isn't it?" he heard Miranda said. What? Say. Fox's voice followed. We built the reactor under the ocean so it could be instantly flooded in the event of a security breach. Is he really that paranoid? I'm gonna plead the fifth on that one. The lift came to a halt in the long, low room. He could see the both of them there, Fox smiling and Miranda marveling. I thought you might like to see what your investment built, he said to her. No radiation, no fossil fuel. A smile spread across her face as she spoke. Free, clean energy for an entire city. If it worked. It doesn't, he said. That's something inside of him would not let go of that thing. Well, this sure is a lot of security for a squib. He didn't answer. 2 years ago, a Russian scientist published a paper on weaponized fusion reactions. 1 week later, your reactor started developing quote-unquote problems. She raised an eyebrow. I think this machine does work. Miranda, if it were operational, the danger to Gotham would be too great. Bruce, he died in a plane crash 6 months ago. Someone else will work out what Dr. Pavlov did. Someone else will figure out how to turn this power source into a nuclear weapon. I need you to take control of Wayne Enterprises and this reactor. And do what with it? She asked. Nothing, until we can guarantee its safety. And if we can't, decommission it, flood it. She was quiet for a minute, a contemplative look on her face. Then she nodded. Well then, Fox said, clapping his hands together, we have a board meeting to get to. Just a note that Dr. Pavlov is called Dr. Pavel, spelled Pavel, in the source material. However, multiple articles noted the fact that apparently Pavel is a given name in Russian, not a surname, so I changed it. I didn't really need to do that, but I did it anyway, because if there's one thing that I loved doing, or at least I loved to do in my old works, it's correcting mistakes from the source material in my fanfics that have nothing to do with that stuff. But anyway. He could hear the chatter from the boardroom as he neared it, the graying sky reflected in its tiled floors. When he entered, he saw that Miranda sat near the front of the tables, near Mr. Fredericks and the other senior members. He thought it was odd, but he realized that she'd probably be sitting near Daggett if she wasn't. He took a seat at the far end. No one seemed to notice that he'd entered. Do they have assigned seating at board meetings? That's a little bit weird. Like, what is this, high school? Once everyone was settled, Daggett began to speak. I'd like to point out that we have a non-board member here, he said, gesturing in his direction, his being Bruce. Highly irregular, even if his family name is above the door. All eyes were on him in a second. Bruce Wayne's family built this company, Frederick said indignantly, and he himself has run it into the ground, sir. Anybody disagree? Check the value of your shares this morning. Gambling on crazy futures didn't just lose Mr. Wayne his seat, it's lost us all a lot of money. He needs to leave. I'm afraid he has a point, Mr. Wayne, Fox said to him. He stood. I understand, ladies and gentlemen. He looked to Miranda, and she nodded. All right, he heard Daggett say once he left the room. Let's get down to business. All right, so that's the end of that chapter. It's very short, but this chapter actually, I would say, does a pretty good job of filling you in on all of the bits and pieces that were missing from the previous 3 chapters, I would say. In particular, it lets you know exactly what happened because of, like, Selina stealing Bruce's fingerprints and, like, what actually went down with that, as well as laying out why exactly Bruce is afraid to show Miranda the reactor and all this stuff. These are bits of information that in the movie are dropped a little bit earlier. Not the Selina thing, but the reactor bit. There's an entire prologue in the movie, of course, which I'm thinking most of you know about, where they show Dr. Pavel getting, like, kidnapped and stuff, and you sort of learn about why he's being kidnapped in this. So you're like, oh, that's what happened. But that straight up doesn't happen here. So this is the first time we're even hearing about Dr. Pavel, you know? And I think that despite that, it does seem like, oh, a late game detail. No, I think it works. Because it's relevant to the scene that it's being set in, but then when you later learn about this, that, and the other, you're like, oh, that's what happened, you know? It wasn't bad. This chapter was really short, but it wasn't bad. Okay, so the next chapter is a John chapter, I'm pretty sure. Yes. Looks like you need a lift. She had found him there in front of the Wayne Enterprises building, security guards holding back a mob of reporters behind him. They were towing his car. Wayne nodded and followed her back to the cruiser. It was odd to see him in his suit and without a cane. People keep commenting on that in this. In particular, like, and this happened in Batman Begins because Bruce commented on it himself. But then in the first chapter, the second chapter, Selina was like, oh, it looks like Bruce Wayne, but this guy is wearing a suit. So clearly it's not. And then John is like, he's wearing a suit. That's kind of weird. I feel like this just reinforces the stuff that I was saying about the whole Selina thing being even more like it just doesn't work. He was quiet as they rode, and she couldn't quite read the expression on his face. The silence between them was unreasonably tense. Why does the Batman wear the mask? She asked, trying to break the silence. To protect the people closest to him, he answered. I didn't take him as the kind of guy who had close friends. There are always people you care about, he said quietly. You just don't realize until they're gone. She noticed the melancholy tone in his voice. But the Batman was supposed to be a symbol. At least that was the idea, anyway. What happened? She took his momentary silence as discomfort. I mean, if you don't mind me asking. No, it's fine. It's just that, I don't know. He's different now. Doesn't seem to be about symbols anymore. She wasn't entirely sure what he meant by that. It was weird. She always thought of the Batman as being the kind of guy who kept himself holed up in a techno dungeon when he wasn't out breaking people's limbs. Not the kind of guy who spoke to people regularly, except maybe whoever got him his toys and the commissioner. And by the way he was talking, Wayne. The two were closer than she had thought, it seemed. Oh man. I actually kind of like John's little like arc about assessing and reassessing the Batman. This is a common thing between her and Selina, because Selina also has an arc about assessing and reassessing the Batman. But I feel like John's works better for me, and we'll talk about Selina stuff as we get into the story, but in particular the unedited chapters. Because the tone that Selina's stuff takes on is it's kind of like, eh. That seems to be a theme of this story. It's very strange. He wants to know if you've got anything on Bane's whereabouts, Wayne said. Yeah, I've got 500 pages of tunnel records and a flashlight. Actually, I could use some help. He was quiet for a minute. You know what? Drop me on King Street. She couldn't guess why he needed to go to the red light district in the middle of the day, but she nodded. Surely there's more there than just, like, sex workers. I don't know, maybe he's going to, like, the fucking corner store. I don't know why Bruce Wayne would be at a corner store, but still, like, there's gotta be something on that road besides all of that. But like he asked for an apartment building on the lower side of the street, only a few blocks from the water. The lower side of the street? Would that not be the western side of the street? That's very strange. Don't wait for me, he said as he got out the car. I'll get a cab. She nodded, but then remembered the news. Wait, do you have any cash? He was already in the front door. She didn't wait, just like he asked. She had other things to do anyway. After a few runs around the city, she got a call that sent her straight to the hospital. Is that how police works? Sure. She'd been there less and less over time. She was still reeling from what she heard the day she visited Wayne. She didn't know what to think of him anymore. She wasn't sure what to think of a lot of things anymore, but Gordon was still the police commissioner. Foley's voice was the one that greeted her when she entered the room, though. Can we help you, officer? John Daggett's body was found in a dumpster an hour ago. I thought you might like to know. Why? Gordon asked her. Because his name is all over the permits I pulled to map the tunnels under Gotham, she said, handing him a thick folder of files. MTA maintenance, sewer construction. Gordon turned to Foley. Where did you get with the tunnel searches? Foley turned to her. Remind me to tell the detail to keep hotheads out. Then to Gordon. We've had teams down there, but it's a huge network. Get more men. Work a grid. I want him found. Yeah, the Max man. We're on it. Foley rose from his spot and moved for the door. This is good work, Gordon said, flipping through the papers. Lose the uniform. You're working for me now. We could use some hotter heads around here. She honestly didn't know how to react, but she smiled, for his benefit. Could be a coincidence, though, she said. You're a detective now, Johnny. You're not allowed to believe in coincidence anymore. And that's the end of that chapter. Again, we get another for his benefit thing that actually does work, considering her shaken faith in Gordon. That wasn't bad. It wasn't bad. I feel like these two, like the Bruce chapter, this John chapter, and then the next Selina chapter work better in tandem. But yeah, this John chapter wasn't bad at all. We got some interesting character moments between her and Bruce. A really interesting development with John Daggett. Literally, like we literally saw him a chapter ago and then he died off screen. Like that was nuts. So things are getting a little bit weird. But yeah, that wasn't bad. Let's move on to Selina's chapter. This chapter kind of scrolls back in time a little bit. The screen in the window rattled against the glass in the heavy wind. Selina looked out of the window warily as she placed another shirt in her suitcase. She wouldn't be able to leave tonight, probably not with that storm barreling towards them. At that rate, she might not be able to leave for a while. Would any of the airports be open tomorrow? She'd just have to try her luck, she thought. Staying there wasn't an option anymore. She started to put another shirt in the bag when she noticed that a few of them were moving around. Sylvia dug her way into the bottom of the bag and poked her head up through the piles of fabric. Selina reached in and pulled her out, but as soon as she hit the bed, she hopped right back in. Oh, cat. She sighed. Jen had promised to take care of her, but she was still considering taking the cat with her. She'd miss her being halfway across the world and all. Why not take the cat? Buy a cage. I'm sure Sylvie has a cage. Just take the cat. You can take a cat on a plane. Cats don't need plane tickets, right? She looked up when she heard Jen on the stairwell. I told you money first. I don't think so. She couldn't believe her ears. There was no way. She threw down the shirt in her hands and headed for the door. Jen, she barked when she opened the door. He's not a mark. He doesn't have a cent to his name anyway. Look, she said to Wayne, I don't know why you're here, but you need to leave. The way that dialogue is split up is very strange. It should have said, like, he's not a mark, he doesn't have a cent to his name, and then she turned to Wayne, look, and then the entire line of dialogue, because that was really weird. Jen must have noticed the tone in her voice. Whoa, 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 what's up? And her eyes widened when she realized who was in front of her. Oh, you're that asshole. Listen, scumbag. I just need to talk to you, Wade said, bewildered. Big mood, wow. Cool it, Jen. What makes you think I want to talk to you? I know we got off on the wrong foot. The wrong foot? That's what you call that? Look, this is really important. Can I come in, please? She could hear the sincerity in his voice. She sighed. Fine, she relented, but I hope you don't plan on staying long. Relented isn't really a adjective. That's weird. Anyway, he followed her into the living room. She could almost feel him looking at how small it was. It's not much, but it's more than you have right now, she said as she turned. They're letting me keep the house, actually. She rolled her eyes. You all don't even go broke the same as the rest of us. A vacation? He was looking inside her bedroom door. When he noticed the expression on her face, he looked down. My powerful friend hopes to change your mind about leaving. How would he do that? By giving you... He stopped when he noticed Sylvie winding around his legs. Cut it out, Sylvie, she said. But she got on her hind legs and started pawing at him. He gave in and picked her up, and she nuzzled into his neck. That was weird, she thought. Sylvie didn't usually take to people Selina didn't like. Interesting. Anyway, Wayne continued, he said he can give you the clean slate. It doesn't exist, she said, turning towards the window. He says it does. He wants to meet tonight. Tonight? Selina said, turning back. Your friend doesn't watch the news much, does he? He insists. She raised an eyebrow. Why? He needs to find Bane. He thinks you'd know how. But when? Whenever it stops raining. She was quiet for a moment, but then said, Tell him I'll think about it. He nodded and placed her cat back on the ground. She followed him all the way to the door. And that's the end of that chapter. Again, this chapter wasn't too bad. This chapter mostly existed to relay this scene of Bruce asking Selina, which is fine. Also setting up the storm that's coming. There's a storm coming, Mr. Wayne. We're gonna have to talk about this storm barreling towards them because it's actually a pretty significant storm in U.S. history. A reminder that the first part of this story takes place in 2012. I'll let you draw what conclusions you may until after the next chapter we read. But yeah, that chapter wasn't bad. All three of the chapters we read weren't bad. And like I said, I think together, they're kind of like a puzzle that puts together a picture to form the story being told. And I think that this is like maybe one of the best examples of overlapping chapters that we've seen so far. The one with John and Selina from like closer to the beginning of the story wasn't bad either. But this is an interesting one because this is the first one where the time in the chapter following one of the others scrolls back that much to tell you what happened. Like I said, the John and Selina overlapping chapters from closer to the beginning of the story, the shootout at the bar. John's chapter rewinds a little bit to a part we saw happen on Paige and Selina's chapter, but this one scrolls back like hours to show you something that happened back in John's chapter, so that's pretty interesting. I think it's also worth noting that John's chapter was written to sort of write around a missing chapter from the fourth POV character too. But yeah, I think he does a good job of doing that. But anyway, let's move on. So we're back to Bruce now. The wind was really starting to pick up. The clouds should have been speeding across the sky, but they were far too heavy. It hadn't started to rain yet, but the sky looked as if it were about to burst. He rang the doorbell out of habit and cursed under his breath when he remembered that Alfred was gone. He moved for the side of the house. He'd never had to carry keys. Interesting. I do think it's interesting that Bruce Wayne has done hard living, but there are still little things that he can't truly understand because he has been rich, like, carrying your keys. Good God. I could not imagine leaving my house without my house keys. And we have a spare key to get into our house. So, like, It's kind of amazing to see that, but anyway. He climbed through the windows in the sitting room just as the rain started. It was strange to see the room so empty. All that remained were a few chairs and one rug, looking incredibly small in the middle of the large space. He went straight to his room after he closed the windows again. The sitting room, is that the same room from Batman Begins where he had that scene with his aunt and his little cousin? I think so. It's hard to keep track of everything in this goddamn house, especially because throughout the story, barring, of course, The Dark Knight, because that doesn't take place here, there seems to be a total of like 3 rooms that you really see more than once. Or rather, really 2 rooms, because there's the study and then Bruce's bedroom, and that's kind of it. Immediately, he discarded his suit in favor of a simple t-shirt and shorts. He was never fond of them, and he'd grown less so once he stopped leaving the house. His phone started vibrating in his suit pocket. It was Miranda. He got right to the point once they exchanged pleasantries, and he stopped wondering how she got his number. What? What do you mean? Okay, number one, do the people at Wayne Enterprises not, like, have his phone number? That's not that weird. Number two, again, the big deal about the suits. I find it kind of strange because, like, yes, I understand that there are some people who just don't like suits, but number one, there are suits that don't require you to wear pants if that's Bruce's problem. Number two, there are pantsuits that are cut in ways that aren't quote unquote like masculine or more like boxy looking, you know? Or having those certain types of angles that people see as masculine. So even though, like, of course, you can always dislike types of clothing. Like my sister, for example, does not usually wear dresses, but I feel like if I wrote her as a protagonist in a story, people wouldn't constantly quote like, "Oh my God, she's wearing a dress," you know. um, it's just interesting. But anyway, how did the meeting go? He asked her. Fox worked the board like you wouldn't believe, she said excitedly. I'm in, Daggett's out, and he's not happy. He actually sighed with relief. Good. There was silence on the other end of the line, but then he heard Miranda say, I'll take care of your parents' legacy, Bruce. I know. They said their goodbyes and he hung up. That was one weight off his shoulders, at least. He still felt dead tired, however, so he laid down for a nap. That conversation's kind of weird when they're not face to face, but it also makes sense that in this version they would not be face to face since Bruce and Miranda aren't really, like, cool like that. Furthermore, if Miranda rolled up on Bruce's house like that, that would also be pretty weird. Like, I think weirder than her having his phone number, quote unquote, randomly. Um, There was a version where she did roll up on his house, though, and the two of them ended up talking about stuff because, again, Bruce and Miranda aren't kind of like hitting it off in this version. But that was back also when Miranda actually had a POV, so definitely a very, very old version of the story. I don't think that even made it to the final first draft. So moving on. When he awoke, it was already dark outside. That's what he got for waking up before noon, he thought. God. The storm had turned absolutely monstrous in the hours that had passed, so he was unsure of whether the power was out or if the power company had cut it off. His only response was to pull the covers over his head. He had thought that he would be more upset about his money, but after the initial shock, it didn't bother him too much. He had thought it was odd that he didn't care until he remembered the years he had spent virtually penniless. Even at the monastery, he had only his bedroll and the clothes on his back. He was used to it already, and he still had much more now than he'd had back then. That's very true. It's interesting to see him think about this. I still find it weird that him and Tony don't have, like, weird contingency plans for this kind of thing. Like, it's just kind of weird to hear Bruce be like, oh man, I don't have any money, when his best friend is literally, like, him and Tony literally go back and forth switching richest man in the world and second richest man in the world. Like, come on. Listening to the sound of the rain drumming against the roof made him think back to all those years, to the night he'd broken into that abandoned apartment in the Narrows. The rain hadn't been nearly that bad, an extra seasonal thunderstorm rather than a Category 3 hurricane. But he still remembered, especially the way it had made the weight of the cape change. He'd been awkward in the air, but then again, that might have been the fear toxin as well as the fire. So about this hurricane. Y'all remember Hurricane Sandy? That's what this is. I think what's really weird about it is that I understand because of the time of year that this takes place, especially because it's supposed to be like super significant with the Bane shit popping off on Halloween, which was a Monday that year, I think. Something like that. Or on the weekend. Something like that. But it had to kind of be like that if this took place in 2012. You can't write out Superstorm Sandy. However, because Gotham City is on the coast of New Jersey, this city would have been absolutely wrecked by the hurricane. Like, and this is something that you do see later down the line, that Gotham City was actually kind of spared a lot of the worst of that hurricane somehow, despite the fact that Gotham City and Atlantic City are not that far from each other, if I'm remembering correctly. It's really not that far. The point is, the entirety of the coast of New Jersey got absolutely, like, fucking destroyed by Hurricane Sandy. So there's, like, kind of, unless I guess the bay protected it, I don't know, but it seems like there would be no way that Gotham City wouldn't just be absolutely wrecked by this storm. And yet when we get to the chapters following Bane's occupation, you see that for the most part, especially the southern part of Gotham City, which has been established, part of that island is really not safe for people to, like, be on. The Hurricane District, literally part of it sunk into the ocean because of hurricanes. And yet the island makes it out mostly okay, and Bruce is like the way this comes across, it seems like Gotham City weathered the storm the way my town weathered the storm. I live on the western side of New Jersey, and I just happen to live up the hill from the Delaware River. So where I live never floods, but everywhere, like, my town is like flood central usually. And that makes no sense. Like, I'm just confusion. But anyway, his thoughts started to drift back to him as he lay there. The Batman had been born in a time of corrupt cops and organized crime, which he and Gordon had all but done away with. Now he had Bane to contend with, and he only had a thought of what he would be up against. But wasn't that how it always went? They thought Crane was working for someone, and it turned out that he'd manipulated one of the most powerful men in the criminal underworld. They thought the Joker was working for someone, and it turned out that he'd manipulated several of the most powerful men in the criminal underworld. He had said that Bane was just a mercenary, but why should that be any different? He just wished he had any clue of what he was up against. He would just have to find out later that night. Eventually, the sound of the storm lulled him back to sleep, and when he woke again, it was with a start. It seemed that the storm had stopped, or at least the rain had. It had to be late, he decided, and when he finally checked the time, he saw that it was past 1 in the morning. How in the world had he slept that long? He put it out of his mind as he climbed out of bed. It was time to go. And that's the end of that chapter. So I feel like the impact of the intro, or the reminiscing about, like, the other criminals, would have been greatened. I don't know what the word is, but it would have had more impact if, we had written out The Dark Knight. I keep saying this, but it's true. The Dark Knight should have been a full-length story because, yes, while The Dark Knight as it exists now does a good job of bridging the gap between the two stories for Bruce's character arc, there's more to that story than Bruce's character arc. And as we can see here, it impacts the way that he thinks about criminals. In the first story, he had kind of absorbed that idea of criminals are pretty simple from Ra's al Ghul, but his experiences with both Dr. Crane and the Joker, clearly here he sees that things are not always the way they seem. But again, this would have helped if we had seen The Dark Knight. But anyway, let's keep going. Hey guys, Editing Frankie here. So at this point, I incorrectly stated that this would be the last chapter that I was going to read for this episode because I completely forgot that the chapter after this is supposed to be part of this first section of the story and not the beginning of the second section. It could go either way, but I read it in this episode, so we're going to treat it that way. So this next chapter is a Selina chapter, so let's jump right in. It was far into the night once the rain had stopped and oh God. It was far into the night once the rain had stopped and the wind still... What? And wind still blowing heavily. That makes no goddamn sense. What shocks me about that is not that there's typos, but there's literally like 2 missing words. How? It was far into the night once the rain had stopped and the wind was still blowing heavily. The streets were soaking wet and would have reflected the streetlights more than usual, but there was no power on that side of town. The tunnels were pitch black behind her and absolutely silent, but she knew that was only this far up. There was no telling what it would be like in the sewers proper. Selina lounged on a short concrete wall separating a train tunnel and a service tunnel from each other. She'd been there for at least an hour and a half, wondering when he would show. She kept an eye out for him, knowing that he wouldn't just stroll up to her. It wasn't his style. As she scanned the shadows again, she noticed a pair of yellow eyes staring at her in the dark. "Don't be shy," she said, raising an eyebrow. He stepped into the low lights. She thought the eyes were a nice touch. The vibrant color was unnaturally creepy. "Wayne says you can get me the clean slate." "That depends." "On what?" she asked. "What you want it for. I acquired it to keep it out of the wrong hands." "Don't trust me?" she said with a small smile. "How can we change that?" "You can start by taking me to Bane." She took a deep breath. "All right," she said as she hopped down. "You asked." She led him down the service tunnel. Okay, so I'm gonna pause right here before we get to the next line of dialogue. I find it funny that Selina comments on Bruce's eyes here and not in the first chapter where they met. But that's whatever. It's kind of interesting. I think this is the first time that a character has actually literally commented on the Batman's like contacts and stuff. I'm trying to avoid mentioning anything about the trains here because, like, does the monorail go on the ground? I really don't need to. I really do not need to talk about the public transportation in Gotham City. I really don't. More importantly, so we see that the power has been knocked out in part of Gotham City, but again, the city should have been absolutely swamped. Like the flooding. Philadelphia, I'm pretty sure, was flooded by Hurricane Sandy. Again, the part of town that I lived in was like the only part that didn't flood. We were kind of like an island because the highways and the other main roads usually are just like completely washed during regular storms. So this was especially bad. And then like again, Atlantic City was like basically underwater. And yet Gotham City's just like, is the island on a higher elevation than the surrounding land or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, moving on. By the way, the next time you need something, just ask me yourself. Why? She gritted her teeth. I know he's your friend, but I don't want that douchebag at my house. He's not that bad. Maybe not to you, but I'm sure you can imagine what it must feel like for a woman to find out a man was watching her leave her house after dark. He grunted. Pass along the message. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about when Selina's arc tries to insert these commentaries on, like, sexism and stuff. And basically trying to say that, like, sometimes the things that Bruce does, he doesn't realize how unnerving they are. He's not a man. I know that, like, I don't know if this is actually true, but there might be times where he refers to himself as a man, but, like, actual gender-wise, he is not male. So her saying this is very, very, like, out of pocket. Just say that, like, for a woman to realize that a person is watching her. Yes, the gender does impact it, but if I walked out of my house and then later found out that another woman was watching me walk out of my house, I would still be creeped the fuck out, you know? So, like, the point there shouldn't be that Bruce is a man, but that Selina is a woman, and that these kinds of things unsettle her because she is a woman. And then Bruce realizing, oh shit, that is kind of... And then you could even draw a connection where if Bruce was like, well shit, if the same thing happened to me, I would also be creeped out because I'm not a dude, you know? But instead, I just changed this, and then the Batman is never like, hey, he's not a dude. Maybe don't misgender my quote-unquote friend. It's just weird. I don't understand why I didn't change this stuff, but I guess that's just the way it was in 2013. Woke enough to put a non-binary person in the story, not woke enough to not have the other character misgender them, but go off, I guess, past me. Anyway, he was silent as they traveled the rest of the way, even into the sewers. They're going into the storm drains, not the sewers, because sewers aren't this big. He didn't seem to be a man of many words. She almost started with a loud stepping when she remembered where she was. The last thing she wanted was for them to hear them coming. From here on, Bane's men patrol the tunnels, she said to him. They're not your average brawlers. Neither am I. She could already see the first of them as she dismounted a flight of stairs. When she turned to the Batman, he was gone. She kept forward anyway. She'd heard that he could see anything. Now was the time to see if that was true. She ran right up to one of the mercenaries. He's behind you, she said in a terrified voice. Who? He answered, bewildered. Me. The Batman dropped down and pulled him up toward the ceiling. She didn't waste time wondering how he'd gotten up there. Further down, she took out two on her own. He hadn't reappeared yet. Lights began to appear as she moved deeper in. Oh, come on. Oh, the story. She kept herself to the shadows and assumed the Batman was doing the same. Bane's men would be good and riled up by then. She slowed as she rounded another corner. There were 3 of them there, guns at the ready. They didn't even try to shoot her. They never suspect a woman, she thought. Not even one in a catsuit. Now that's commentary that fucking makes sense. Oh, this story. What do you think you're doing? One of them asked her. He was suddenly pulled into a space in the wall. She turned to run. She knew the other 2 would be right behind her. She could hear their footsteps, but then there was a whooshing sound and they stopped. She turned. One of them was gone, the other fumbling for his gun on the ground. She went right up to him and kicked it out of his hands, then slit his throat with her heel. Batman landed almost silently by her side. Didn't we talk about that? Different people, different policies, she said with a shrug. I don't feel as strongly about the whole no guns thing as you do either. She actually heard him let out a sigh. Big mood, wow. They came upon a space deep in the bowels of the tunnel system, much bigger than even she had expected. A bridge spanned a massive pit that opened to another concrete floor, split in half by a river of rushing water that was spanned by another smaller bridge. Kind of confusing, but I see the symbolism of the massive pit there. Just a little further, she said to him as they approached the bridge. As soon as he passed onto it, a grate came smashing down between them. I had to find a way to stop them trying to kill me. It was a shame. She was just starting to like him, but it was his ass or hers, and she was all about self-perseverance. You made a serious mistake, he snarled. His eyes were absolutely burning. Sorry for not snarling that. You made a serious mistake, he snarled. Not a oh, this is Bane. Whoops. I can't do a Bane voice. I cannot, so we're just gonna have to deal with it. Hoo boy, I forgot. Oh man. Not as serious as yours, I fear. The voice that answered him seemed to come out of nowhere at all, and it was far too deep. See, Selina keeps saying that his eyes are too dark, his voice is too deep. Batman turned away from her. Bane. She looked past the Batman and saw him standing at the far end of the bridge. He was at least 100 feet from them, but he still looked absolutely huge. Stop saying absolutely, my God! An involuntary shudder ran through her. She'd suddenly become very cold. Oh no! Oh no! Let us not stand on ceremony here, Mr. Wayne. Her eyes widened. There was no way, not a chance in hell, but the Batman didn't say a word. They met in the middle of the bridge. Bane towered at least a foot over him. Ooh. You know, Batman's height is never disclosed, but I always imagine Bruce being like 6'2", which is, I think, Batman's height in the comics, which means that Bane is like over 7 feet. God damn. Fuck you, Tom Hardy. Moving on. Batman began to throw punches, but Bane barely moved. He kept at him until Bane caught his fist. He said nothing, just staring at him. She couldn't read the expression on his face. Batman let out a hiss, trying to pull his fingers free. Then Bane started to fight back. He moved like lightning, much faster than a man his size should have been. And they moved in sync with each other, almost like they were dancing. There should be a comma after each other. It put her on edge to think of it like that. She blinked and Bane had kicked Batman over the railing. Batman used his cape to land on his feet, and Bane swung onto a chain and climbed down to meet him. She moved to see them again. It was like watching a car wreck. They continued down there, terribly synchronized, but then Batman started to fall behind. She watched as Bane grabbed him by the neck and smashed him into a metal pole, and then picked him up to his feet and kicked him back to the ground. Heh. Batman pulled something from his belt and threw it. Bangs echoed through the sound of water, and a cloud of smoke hovered near them. What I will say is that for the run-on sentences and extra words that don't need to be there, I think this is one of the better written fight scenes in this entire series. Because the fight itself isn't overly concerned with trying to relay every single move, but it doesn't cop out of the fight entirely by just doing the analyzing the fighting style of the other person thing that I did in Batman Begins. This actually does strike a nice balance between both of those two things. So you can gloss over parts of the fight, but you still get parts of the fight. I was going to comment on the fact that she said they continued down there terribly synchronized, and then Batman started to fall behind. This is something that's come up in at least one other story that I wrote, but I feel like I've said it in other ones. And it's usually phrased as a character, like the two characters are fighting with each other and then someone like loses step. Off the top of my head, the one that I'm thinking about is chapter 10 of Call It What You Want, when Captain America fights Loki in Germany. That fight, I think it's like that Steve is able to keep up, but then I think Steve loses step at a point and Loki manages to get the upper hand. I feel like there is something like this in Speak of the Devil too, possibly episode 10 of season 1, when he fights, well, I won't say who it is because if you haven't read it, it's kind of a spoiler. It's the equivalent of the fight from the episode Speak of the Devil in the TV show, but it's not called that in mine. But I think that same turn of phrase is used there, but I'm not entirely sure. I can't say. But yeah, it's interesting how that kind of thing, even that far down the line, if it is in Daredevil, that's a long time after I wrote this. And yet it's still kind of stuck around in my head. But moving on. Theatricality and deception are powerful agents to the uninitiated, Bane said. But we are initiated, aren't we, Bruce? You were excommunicated by a gang of psychopaths, Batman said. I dismissed myself, just like you did, Bane responded. I should have killed him when I had the chance and danced on his grave. Oh, man. You should have killed him. No, Batman rasped at him. That's what separates me from him, from you. Bane actually chuckled. I know. I had to finish what you started. Batman hissed like a cat and flung himself off the ground, but Bane caught him and sent him smashing back into the ground. Come on. She didn't know what Bane had meant by finishing what he'd started, but whatever it was had royally pissed Batman off. Oh, yeah. So this is a thing that actually got put in the rewrite that wasn't there before, because I had been very consciously setting up a fourth Batman story where Bruce was finally going to take on Ra's al Ghul. By the time I got around to doing this big edit of this in 2014, I didn't want to do that anymore. So I just had Ra's al Ghul die off screen, which it does seem like a cop-out. I should have just like sucked it up and set up that story. But then this whole thing got kicked out of continuity, so it didn't matter anymore. It is also very strange though, because that's literally the whole reason why Batman wasn't in the Avengers, but I don't remember doing any plans to write Batman into the Avengers after I decided to make that change. So like, what was the excuse? She didn't see any of the technique that he'd had before. He was just throwing himself at Bane. They started moving so fast she barely had any idea of what was happening. The next thing she knew, Batman was on the floor again. Then the lights went out. Oh boy. You think darkness is your ally? His tone had changed, his being Bane. Darker was the only word she could think to describe it as. That feeling of dread began to fill her again. There was a crash. You merely adopted the dark. I was born in it, formed by it. I thought he said molded by it, whatever. His voice seemed to echo unnaturally off the walls. She gritted her teeth at the sound of it, and her head began to ache. I didn't see the light until I was already a man, and by then it was nothing to me but blinding. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it was like his voice was in her mind. It felt like her brain was aching, like it was being pressed by a vice. The shadows betray you because they belong to me. Selina squeezed her eyes shut. It felt like her head had exploded. Someone was screaming, a blood-curdling cry that trilled in her ears, but then there was silence. When she opened her eyes again, she was back at the mouth of the tunnel. When had she gotten back there? Why was she lying on the ground? She didn't remember. She got to her feet and wiped the dirt from her face. Her hand came back streaked with black. Had she been crying? She looked back at the tunnels, but was met by the same darkness she'd seen before. What happened to the Batman? What happened to me? She muttered to herself. She decided that it didn't matter now. She needed to go home. She looked back once more after she jumped the fence. She thought she could see someone in the shadows, but it seemed they were just a pair of bright blue eyes floating in the dark. She brushed it off and headed for the street. She would be rid of all of this in the morning. And that's the end of that chapter. So that was good. I have to say that Bane's appearance actually, like, me reading it out loud, I feel like actually kind of ruined it, because when you imagine Bane's voice on your own, it comes across as a lot scarier, and I can't mimic that. But I have to say, his actual entrance into, like, the story is pretty goddamn creepy. I think it works. Yeah, that chapter wasn't bad. Of course, it had its, like, little moments, but they were little moments. For the most part, it was pretty good. So, this next chapter, you know what? I won't say whose chapter it is, because you'll figure it out very soon. The first thing he felt was the pain. It seared through his back, burned through his shoulders, and scorched his legs. He was a pounding inferno. His body ached with every beat of his heart. How did that happen? He knew, but he couldn't remember. He tried, but he couldn't think past the pain. He couldn't even see past the pain. Everything looked like a blur. He felt hands on him, moving him and readjusting him. It hurt him so much, but he couldn't stop them. Any move he tried to make just made him hurt more. He felt the hands at his spine, pressing into him. He hissed in pain. I feel like there had to be better ways to write this so there wasn't so much repetition. It's like he and him and he and him and him. You know? You know when that happens, when you repeat a word so much you fucking explode. He has a protruding vertebra, he heard a voice say. I am surprised he still has a spine, another said. What will you do? I'm going to force it back. Why bother? Third voice said. You should let him die. Don't question him, the first voice said. If Bane wants him to live, then he will live. The mention of the name caused his memories to start to push their way past his pain. Again, there has to be a better way to write this. But they were interrupted when the pain exploded across his body. He yelled out, writhing in agony. He didn't understand the voices anymore. He could barely hear them past his own screams. Stop moving, the first voice said to him. You're just making it worse for yourself. He felt someone hold down his shoulders and someone else pressing into his back again. He spat like a cat at the hand that pressed into the sore spot, and someone shushed him. He shut his eyes when his vision started to double. How would he know that? His vision's already blurry. The blurs. There's two blurs. Oh, God. His breaths came quicker, and he could feel his heart pounding beneath him, but then he felt a needle slide into his back, and everything began to slow. The pain began to fade, replaced by a thick, cold feeling that creeped through his body. That should be crept, I think, but whatever. It took effort to open his eyes again, and when he did, everything was darker and blurrier. He didn't feel like he was there at all. He was half convinced he was dreaming. He couldn't focus on a thing beneath the weight of his eyelids. There were people in the room with him still. He couldn't see them properly, but he could feel them there, vaguely warm spots in the mush of colors that the room had turned into. There was a particularly potent one very close to him, but his vision swam too much for him to see who it was. His voice, however, was unmistakable. Uh-oh. Leave us, Bane said to the others. He felt them disappear slowly, and then he felt him pressing at his jaw. Something inside him compelled him to try and bite him when he pulled at the corner of his mouth. He pulled back then. "Where am I?" Bruce said to him. His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. So this is another one of those chapters where the character's name is withheld on purpose until a certain point. And I think this one works pretty well. Because there are times where it seems like it's just kind of random that the character's name pops up, but there are other times where I think it kind of works, and I think in this chapter it kind of adds to the feeling of distortion. Bane's voice was clear as day, like it was in his head. "Your trophy room," he told him. Bruce didn't understand. "Why didn't you kill me?" Bruce asked. Bane seemed to ignore him. "Listen to me, and listen to me well, Bruce. I will make this offer only once." Bane's face suddenly became very clear in his vision, though the rest of the room swam around him. Ugh! Bruce had no choice but to stare into his cold eyes, and he felt as if he was gazing into an abyss. "For far too long this city has been ruled by the corrupt and the dishonest. In a few days I mean to change that. You had noble intentions, but your deceit has cost you your peace. By the time you have healed, it will be far too late for you to stop us, but, and I shouldn't be so kind, you might still be able to help us." "I'm not going to kill for you," Bruce spat at him. "I'm not asking you to. I'm offering you a chance to do what you set out and failed to do. Maybe, in the time you spend here, you'll learn to serve true justice. And if I don't?" He was silent a moment, and then answered, "I'll see to it that you do." Bruce's vision began to swim again, and he heard Bane leave the room. He decided not to force his aching eyelids to stay open any longer. The darkness comforted him immediately. And that's the end of part 1 for real this time. The content of this chapter is good. The writing of this chapter got on my goddamn nerves. Part of it is because I purposefully was playing the pronoun game, but there's just so much, like, the way the parts before it said Bruce's name were written really got on my goddamn nerves. Him. That's all I have to say about that. But again, the actual content of this chapter is really interesting and kind of a game changer. And that's why I realized that this is the actual last chapter, because this is the kind of, like, this is the note you leave the first story on. So when you get to the second half of it, you're like, oh, shit, things are kind of different, aren't they? Because we see here that the things that Bane says to Batman are very different than the things that Bane says to Batman in the equivalent of this scene in the movie, which is after Batman is taken to that prison halfway across the world. We have no idea where he is in this chapter, because Bruce can't fucking see. But the fact that Bane's, instead of being like, "I'm gonna leave you here to rot and you're gonna watch Gotham die, moo-hoo-hoo, ha-ha, I'm the League of Shadows," like that kind of thing, Bane's like, "Look, I'm gonna do something with all the corruption in Gotham, and you had noble intentions, but you fucked up, but I'm gonna give you a chance to unfuck your fuck." And it's like, what? Hold on. And I think that's really good, because when we get to the second half, you'll start to put together what's really going on with him. Things really aren't the way that they seemed in the beginning of the story. So, yeah, so we're done the first part of this. I will say, the first half of this, it stumbles at the beginning. It has its downfalls. There are definitely some issues that I definitely should have known better to fix and write around. And I think the editing could have been better. And in general, the quality of the writing, while it's definitely, like, a lot better than Batman Begins, it still could have been better. For what it is, this part of the story is actually really good. Like, I keep thinking of it as a story that was written primarily in 2013 and then edited a year later in early 2014. It's not bad. It really isn't. Wow. I'm really glad. And I'm also kind of sad, because I feel like once we get past the edited parts of the next section of the story, I remember the last time I read through this, I literally, like, visibly felt myself deflate once we get to the unedited chapters. But I'm going to try and keep my hopes up that the content will win out over the actual, like, vehicle that is delivering it. But yeah, so this part of the story, and I do have to give an assessment like this, and I'll do it again when we finish all of the unedited chapters, because the story really does change quite a bit in the unedited part. But yeah, anyway, this part of the story is actually really good. I'm kind of impressed at parts of it. So that's always good. But that is the end of this episode. I hope you enjoyed the first quote unquote half, the first third of The Dark Knight Rises. Next episode, we will be beginning the last two-thirds of the story and moving into the parts where Batman's not there anymore. Oh no. So I will see you for that. If you like this video, like it on the YouTubes, and subscribe and watch some other videos. I would tell you to catch up, but I really hope that you're not trying to jump into this reread in this episode. That just seems like a bad idea. But if you have to catch up, why not? Maybe listen to some of the other podcast series about old fanfics that I have from the Fanfic Reread Project. Who knows? And I will see you next episode. Bye!